Okay, welcome everybody to the second revision lesson for the USA module, paper 3. Today we're going to be focusing on progress in education for the civil rights movement between the years 1954 and 57. You've probably spent the last 2 or 3 lessons looking at this topic, and like we did last time, today we're just going to review the topic and hopefully it will address anything you're uncertain about or might need going over again. Okay, so in today's session, we're going to look at firstly Plessy v. Ferguson, then we're going to look at the events of Brown versus Topeka, then we're going to look at the impact of Brown versus Topeka, and finally, we're going to look at the Little Rock Nine. Before we begin though, we'll just go through a few key definitions just to make sure that you're okay with these words, as I will be using them during this presentation. Our first one is the Supreme Court, where a lot of the drama takes place for the events we're looking at. This is the most important law court in the USA, where the most important decisions are made on the law. There are 9 judges who are in the Supreme Court. The most important judge is the Chief Justice. So he's the top judge. He's the boss of all the other judges. We've also got public school, where many of our events take place. This is a state school in the USA, so it is run by the US government. Desegregation. So we've looked at segregation, now we're looking at desegregation. This is the policy of ending segregation. Another word you might see, which is similar to desegregation, is integration, again, meaning the mixing of black and white students. Unconstitutional is our last word. This means going against the Constitution. So the Constitution was set out when the USA was founded. It is the set of rules and laws of the USA. So if something is unconstitutional, it's going against the rules or laws of a country. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at Plessy v. Ferguson. This is a legal case which takes place in the Supreme Court in 1896, so a long time before our course begins, but it's really important for us to understand the context, so that's why we look at Plessy v. Ferguson. The outcome of this case stated that segregation was constitutional, so it was allowed and it was in agreement with the laws of the USA, if facilities were separate but equal. So, for example, there could be separate schools for black and white children as long as the state authorities, so the school boards, could prove that the children were receiving the same standard of education. So, in a nutshell, Plessy v. Ferguson allowed the Jim Crow laws, the segregation laws, to stay in place in the South. Now, a certain group of people were very opposed to Plessy v. Ferguson, and this was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured Peoples. The aim, or one of the main aims of the NAACP, was to overturn the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling. This meant that they needed to prove in a court, hopefully the Supreme Court, that separate was not equal. Their main argument was that separate but equal facilities were always going to be inherently unequal because they made black Americans feel inferior to white Americans. So it doesn't matter whether your schools, your black and white schools, are of the same standard and students receive the same quality of education. The black students will always feel inferior because they are at a school for black children, and therefore separate is not equal. And this was their argument they used in Brown versus Topeka, which is the main case revolving around desegregation in schools. How does Brown versus Topeka start? It starts with one girl, Linda Brown. Okay, Linda Brown was one of the many black children in Topeka, which is a city in Kansas, who had to pass their local white school to travel to their nearest black school. What's special about Linda Brown is that her father, Oliver Brown, was a member of the NAACP, and he decided to take his daughter's case to the Supreme Court. Oliver Brown argued that it was not fair that his daughter had to travel further to attend a black school when there was a white school closer to their home. So this is how Brown versus Topeka came into being. There are 4 key events of Brown versus Topeka, and we're going to look at these key events now. We start off in 1952 when the case begins. The NAACP put forward their argument that separate was not equal because it made black children feel inferior. The case initially didn't go very well for the NAACP. The judges of the Supreme Court were pro-segregation, so they made the case very difficult for them. However, this all changed in December 1952. The Chief Justice, who was pro-segregation, died. And he was replaced by a man called Earl Warren, who was not pro-segregation and was more open to the NAACP's argument. So this really turned the tide for the NAACP because they had a Chief Justice who was more willing to listen to them and accept their views. This leads us to May 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. They said that the USA had moved on since Plessy v. Ferguson and it was now time for schools to desegregate. However, they didn't really set any laws into motion, so it took until May 1955 for the Supreme Court to say that desegregation should be carried out in all schools with all deliberate speed. Okay, so we go from segregation being allowed in education to the Supreme Court saying that desegregation should take place. So it's a really, really important case, and it's the first main achievement for the civil rights movement. However, when we look at consequences and impacts, there are, as there is with any historical event, positive and negative consequences. And we're going to start off with the short-term impact of Brown versus Topeka. So, on the positive side. Firstly, by the end of 1957, 723 schools had desegregated in the South. That is a win for the civil rights movement. Because of this landmark case, this paved the way for other civil rights groups to campaign for desegregation in other services unrelated to education. And also, the case was good publicity for the NAACP and the civil rights movement, attracting more support and raising more awareness. So it's really the point where the civil rights movement really picks up pace and gets going. However, though, there are many negative consequences in the short term. The main consequence is that there was an extreme white backlash against desegregation, both violent and non-violent. We'll start off with the more violent groups. We have the setting up of white citizens' councils in July 1954 to oppose desegregation in schools. Also, there is a marked increase in KKK membership, so membership of the Ku Klux Klan, and that meant that there was an increase in violence against desegregation, and many of these acts of violence were targeted at black children who were attending desegregated schools. School boards also resisted desegregation. They said that they were making plans, but because the Supreme Court had set no time limit for it to happen, these boards just did nothing. They would say, oh, it's in the works, we're working on it, but actually desegregation never happened. And actually, many black people felt in a worse position after Brown versus Topeka. Although they had gained a legal right, it became clear that desegregation was going to be difficult and dangerous to actually work in practice. In the longer term, positively, there was now a constant legal pressure for desegregation in the South. The NAACP had shown that desegregation could happen in schools. Now it said is the time for other areas of life to be desegregated. And also, awareness for the civil rights movement and civil rights issues dramatically increased, thanks to the really good publicity that the Brown case attracted. On the other hand, desegregation, it was clear, was dangerous. Many black students faced violence at their new integrated schools, whether it was from peers, parents, or more radical groups such as the KKK. Many black schools, we need to remember, were really, really good schools. They gave good education to black students before desegregation. And many of these schools were now shut. And very good teachers, very good black teachers, lost their jobs. And also, although the Supreme Court had said desegregation should happen, many whites took desegregation into their own hands and decided if they were opposed to desegregation, they would simply move out of their community with a large black population. So they'd move to an area which was predominantly white, so they wouldn't have to allow their children to attend school with black and white students. This became known as the white flight, and this created a new type of segregation in America. It was more of a segregation by individual choice than it was by law, but it was still segregation. So we always ask the question with Brown versus Topeka, was it a success? Yes, in some ways, because it was the first real unpicking of the Jim Crow laws, but Brown versus Topeka made it really, really clear that there was going to be resistance to the civil rights movement, a theme that we will see as we go through this course. So we're now going to look at Little Rock High. This is our last topic on this revision session, and Little Rock High is useful for us on this course because it's a really good example of Brown versus Topeka in practice. So what happens when the black students turn up to these newly desegregated schools? Okay, so we don't want to think of Brown versus Topeka as a happy ever after for the civil rights movement. There's still a long way to go. And it's really obvious that there is a long way to go when we look at Little Rock High. So Little Rock High, this case study really shows us that despite the efforts of Brown versus Topeka, white communities in the South were still opposed to desegregation, and they were going to do what they could to try and prevent it from happening in their areas. 9 black students enroll at Little Rock High School in Arkansas. This is how our story begins, and some of their pictures are there on the screen for you. They become known as the Little Rock 9. So they enroll to attend a newly desegregated school in Arkansas. The events that unfolded on the first day of term showed how deeply divisive, so dividing, the issue of desegregation was in the South. And let's look at these events now. So we start off with the 3rd of September. This is the first day of term. Elizabeth Eckford, who is one of the Little Rock 9, turns up to school. She is met by a mob of angry white protesters, a mix of parents, students, and members of the community who are angry at the fact that black students are attending what was a white school. She goes towards state troops who are guarding the school and asks to be let in. They refuse. So she's turned up to school, but state troops are telling her she is not allowed to enter the building. Why? They had been ordered by the pro-segregation governor of Arkansas, Orval Phobos, to not let these students in. So even though desegregation had been allowed, the governor of Arkansas was saying, no, these students will not attend this school. The next day, news of the events at Little Rock spread like wildfire. It puts the US government in a very tricky position because images of Elizabeth Eckford being turned away from the school, images of angry white protesters shouting racist abuse at the Little Rock 9 really create a bad image for the USA abroad. So the US government gets some bad publicity and they decide they need to intervene in this situation. So, a few weeks later, President Eisenhower, who's the president of the USA, he orders Governor Phobos to remove all state troops from outside the school. What happens? Riots break out. So the white protesters take action into their own hands and they riot outside of the school to prevent these black students from attending. So not only were the state troops preventing the Little Rock Nine. It's now the community who are preventing the Little Rock Nine from going to school. This leads President Eisenhower to act again the next day when he issues a presidential order sending troops to Little Rock, allowing the Little Rock Nine to attend school. So the Little Rock Nine now have presidential support to attend school as they're being escorted by Eisenhower's troops. Thinking about the outcomes of Little Rock then. The school year ends in May 1958, so the Little Rock Nine attend school for the year. However, Phobos then decides to close the school for the next year to try and delay integration or desegregation. He was then ordered to reopen the school as a desegregated school in May 1959. So 2 years later, Little Rock does become a desegregated school where both black and white students can attend. However, white citizens' councils grow rapidly after the events at Little Rock, and they campaign using students, parents, community members against desegregation of schools. The KKK increases its bombings and intimidation, especially towards black students and their families, to try and intimidate students and prevent them from coming to desegregated schools. And many school boards make it increasingly difficult for desegregation to happen. So, for example, they might allow black and white students to attend the same school, but once the black and white students enter the school doors, they are then segregated in the school building. So they have different lessons, they can use different areas of the school, but they never actually mix. They also make it more difficult for black students to enroll in school, for example, through entrance tests, slightly like the literacy test for voter registration, making it difficult for black students to gain access to the school. So those are our key events in the Progress in Education chapter. The civil rights movement have made some really positive gains, but it was clear by 1957 that attitudes in the South were not changing. So there was a much bigger fight that the civil rights movement had to engage in. So hopefully you found this useful and interesting. Just to go over what we've covered today, we've looked at Plessy versus Ferguson. We've looked at the events of Brown versus Topeka. We've looked at the impact of Brown versus Topeka, and we've looked at what happened to the Little Rock Nine. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting and useful. I will see you again for the next revision session.